what can we learn from our big data set? I think let's just quantify first of all what our data set is. We've had a laboratory up in Pocklington performing the analysis of soil, leaf, organic manures, all sorts of materials connected to agriculture, horticulture, now for over 40 years. We've been collecting the data electronically since 1995, and that actually equates to over 20 million individual data points now, and that's growing. And that's global, over 90 countries, but obviously the bulk from the UK. For the purposes of today, I thought let's keep it relevant, and let's just look at what we've learned and accrued from 2010 onwards. So picking up on what Sarah was saying, if we're going to move into an era of potentially pushing nitrogen application rates higher than previously, searching for higher yields, then ultimately the effectiveness, the value we're going to get out of that nitrogen will be hampered if there are any limiting factors in our system. And Sarah mentioned soil conditions, disease pressure, weed pressure, but of course there's also the other very real likely potential for limiting factor due to the limits of supply of other vital and key crop nutrients. And that's where soil analysis and our analytical services can come into play. So the robustness of these soils, the fertility of these soils, the base health of these soils is key. And we can measure that in a laboratory. We can measure each individual aspect of potential soil fertility, its physical fertility. Let's do an accurate texture analysis. Let's not just get this soil betwixt finger and thumb and hazard a guess. Let's get some accurate sand, silt, clay data behind our recommendations. We can think in terms of biological fertility. Yeah. Do some very basic organic matter testing. Organic matter is the habitat and the food source for that soil biology. Those bacteria, those fungi, those protozoa, all those microbes that drive mineralization of that soil, keep that soil alive. Also drive, of course, nitrification of any non-nitrate sources of nitrogen to feed that crop. But where we really come into our own, of course, is looking at chemical fertility. That's where analysis really can help you find any holes in your soil's performance and your soil status that need filling. So it is going to mean doing more of this, I'm glad to say, or certainly hope, and it is going to mean really looking at the analysis data we get back, acting upon it, and feeding this into our nutrient management situation. I make no apologies if we're talking about chemical fertility and the stages of our soils. I make no apologies for starting with soil pH, because soil pH ultimately drives so much of the availability of the nutrition that's already existing within our soils, and also the availability and the usage of the nutrition we're going to bring. Be that in the form of mineral fertilizers, be that in the form of organic inputs, having an appropriate pH somewhere in that reasonably neutral zone is really going to maximize what we can get out of this system and out of our soils. Yet, when we look at the data, so this is UK arable soils, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales and England since 2010, and during that time we've processed over 500,000 soils in the UK. We actually see almost half requiring some form of lime management, some form of pH management. 20% with a pH of less than 6, where we're really going to start to impact upon our NPK usage efficiency. Yes, more acidic soils, of course, up in Scotland, down in the west, moving down to more calcareous soils in the south. But in all of those regions, there are soils that require pH management and attention. If we can't get that right, we really shouldn't be worried about what's coming after. But of course, we should just think in terms of nitrogen. We've got to think in terms of other macronutrients as well. We know phosphorus, potassium, absolutely intrinsically linked to the yield we're going to expect from our crops. I stole this on page 34 of the current RB209. I don't know what page they're going to be in the next edition. Maybe you can tell us, Sarah. Certainly going to be in there. And this link between phosphorus and potassium in the soil in ready-to-go form, in plant-available forms, and how they are very directly linked to the yields we can expect from our crops. Low levels of soil-available phosphorus and potassium will limit yield, and therefore are limiting the efficiency and the usage and the value we're going to get out of these increased N applications. But what do we actually see in the data set? What do we see in these 500,000 soils? Well, we see on UK arable soils, more than a quarter are at yield or potentially yield inhibiting levels of phosphorus. Half are at a level where we're requiring phosphorus management. So that's either phosphorus buildup or replacement at the very least of the offtake, maintenance. So over half UK soils are needing phosphorus inputs. Again, we've got some quite high levels up in the north in Scotland, but down the east of England, we're seeing phosphorus deficiency in the soils we see running at over 1 in 2. In those areas marked in red, northeast, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire, real high levels of yield inhibiting phosphorus deficiency. What about potassium? Almost a third of soils at levels that are potentially yield inhibiting. A third of soils, index 0 or index 1, again over half requiring some form of potassium management, either in terms of build-up or replacing what we're removing. If we don't do that, we're going to mine these soils and we're not setting ourselves up for the future. Rather an inverse here. We see the chronic levels of deficiency up in the north, down in the west, and greater levels of sufficiency as we come further south and in the east. Although when I look at those two maps, I do always ask myself the question, I'm not quite sure where a bag of 20-10-10 fits in anywhere in the UK. Do the analysis, find out what you need. Our new friend, who's quickly becoming a familiar friend, sulfur. We've all seen that, there's no point in dwelling on that. We all know sulfur deposition, atmospheric deposition is as low as it's ever been. That particular chart I've grabbed, what's that? That covers 1970 up to the turn of the century. So we're down to next to no sulfur through atmospheric deposition. But interestingly, when we go back in the data, we can actually produce a graph from the soil analysis that is the exact opposite. Except here what we're looking at is we're looking at the percentage of soils that are below our guideline for available sulfur. So that's sulfur in the sulfate form, readily available, ready to go. So I said our data set goes back to 95. We go back to 1995, we find 63% of soils were below our guideline for sulfur. We fast forward to the current day, I think it's about 96, 97% of the UK arable soils we see through the lab below our guideline for sulfur. The method hasn't changed. We certainly haven't moved the guideline. So all that's changed, all that's been depleted, is this reserve of sulfur in a plant available form in UK soils. And I think we can now safely say that's pretty exhausted. I see someone's rather optimistically put an arrow on that trend line there to indicate where it might be going next, but it's not really got a lot more room for progression, has it? But of course, it takes more than NPK and sulfur to grow a crop. It takes a whole host of nutrients. Plants take up a whole range of nutrients for different functions, processes. Today is not the day to go into the roles and the purposes of each of those, but it's simply to accept the fact that there's more to grow in a crop than NPK and sulfur. So our friend Liebig Barrel and his law of the minimum is more appropriate than ever, I would say. So the law of the minimum simply defines that a deficiency of any single nutrient is enough to limit yield. Or to put it a different way, the efficiency, the value you're going to get out of your most abundant nutrient is actually going to be limited by the scarcity of the least. Or to put it in very plain English, how I like it, a chain is only going to be as strong as its weakest link. So if we're going to test soils, why are we stopping at pH, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium? Why are we not testing for a complete nutrient requirement? And when we do that, and we look at the data we've got, it shows a little bit more to the picture, and it reveals a few more of these potential limiting factors. So if all the soils we'd received since 2010 had a good pH, good level of phosphorus, potassium, and a good level of all the key nutrients we require to grow a cereal crop, that'd be great. Let's take out of that scenario all the soils that are deficient in phosphorus. So there's our 27% phosphorus deficiency again. Of what's left, let's take out the soils that are also deficient in potassium. Magnesium, a few of those. So now we've got left 42% of UK arable soils. Let's take out the soils that had a poor pH. And then let's take out the soils that were deficient in key nutrients for growing our crop of wheat. Let's take out those that were deficient in copper, manganese, and zinc. And we're actually left with only 13.5% of soils on a soil test showing adequate pH, adequate P and K, and adequate supplies of key nutrients. So only about, what's that, 1 in 7, 1 in 8? My maths isn't that good. So what that's saying is if you invest in complete soil analysis, you invest in looking at the soil, the nutrient levels in the soil, 7 times out of 8, you're going to find opportunities that potentially will improve yield, improve productivity. 7 times out of 8, you're going to be identifying potential limiting factors to your nitrogen usage. And we see a similar scenario on oilseed rapes. The soils where we knew oilseed rape was being cropped, was going in. Let's take out the phosphorus deficient, the potassium deficient, the magnesium deficient, those on a poor pH again. And then let's look at some key nutrients, calcium, boron, and manganese. And we're left with 7% soils being fit for purpose. So 9 times out of 10, soil analysis can help us identify a potential limiting factor. I haven't included molybdenum on there because 2 reasons. Number 1, I'm not wholly convinced there's a good way of assessing extractable molybdenum from the soil. Number 2, we know molybdenum availability on acidic soils is negligible, and we've certainly just seen the pH scenario. If we include molybdenum, we might be looking at that. So we've done our soil test, hopefully. We need to use that. We need to create an effective nutrient management plan. And part of any nutrient management plan, we've got to account for any organic inputs we're going to bring to the party, bring to the situation. The problem with these organic inputs, of course, is they can be variable. So again, I thought, let's go and have a look in the data and see if we can get an idea about how variable they might be. And let's consider when it's worth using a book value for our NPK values or worth of our organic inputs, and maybe when it might be worth doing a test. So what we have here is we have season by season, going back to 2005, nitrogen, the average seasonal nitrogen content of all the slurry samples we tested through the lab. So 2005, the 4 seasons. 2006, the 4 seasons, or 4 quarters. These have all been normalized to 6% dry matter, so we can compare one with the other. And in red across there, we've got the current RB209 book value, standard book value for cattle slurry. And we can see some seasons we're above that book value on average, some seasons we're below, but by and large it varies around about that book value. So it seems a reasonable figure to take, that 2.6 kilograms per meter cubed of nitrogen we see in RB209 at present. Phosphorus, we got a little bit more variability in there, season by season. It's not unreasonable to expect there will be some variability. We've got dilution effects, evaporation effects, variables due to change in diet. But again, we're somewhere hovering around that RB209 book value, in this instance of 1.29 kilograms per meter cube of phosphorus. But when we get to potassium in slurry, we can see that the seasonal average, going back to 2005, never matches the value that is stated in RB209 of 3.2 kilograms per ton or kilograms per meter cube. So if we're relying upon these book values to populate our nutrient management plans, we have to be aware there could be inaccuracies in there, and in this instance, we're selling ourselves short on our potash requirements. And this ties in, no surprise to me, that on the grassland soils we analysed through the lab, 40% of those are index 0 or index 1, and that is rising. So organic inputs are variable. it's worth doing a test and getting some precise figures. Your nutrient management plan will be only as accurate as the figures you put in there. So we've done our soil tests, we've got our plan. Hopefully by now we're growing a crop, but there's still plenty of opportunity to manage that crop, and there's certainly plenty of opportunities for this limiting factor to your nitrogen efficiency and limiting factor to your yield expectations to rear its head. Plenty of reasons why nutrition in the soil won't get in that crop: compaction, water, too much, too little, soil temperatures, disease pressure, nutrient interactions. So using leaf testing really is the most effective way of monitoring that nutrient uptake and seeing whether the plans we put in place are working. As nutrient concentration decreases in the leaf, so will yield, so will growth, so will productivity. And when it gets chronic, we see that manifest itself in nutrient deficiency signs, nutrient deficiency symptoms. We've got one here. Does anyone want to have a guess at what this one is? No? So we've got manganese deficiency showing its head here. But of course, leaf testing gives us the opportunity to pick up that deficiency before it becomes so chronic as to express itself in the crop with visible symptoms. And using this leaf testing early in the season gives us the best opportunity to intensify these hidden hungers and to do something about it. To quite simply get the appropriate nutrition in the spray tank. So looking at the tissue samples we processed this spring, during those critical opportunities for getting some nutrition into the crop, this is looking at winter wheat, 43% deficient in manganese, 44% deficient in copper, massive levels of zinc deficiency this year. And even on their own, in their own right, they're quite striking and quite significant. What is more interesting is when we overlay those rates of deficiency, we can see that 85% of the wheat tissue samples we analysed were showing a key nutrient deficiency. But 57% were deficient in 2 or more of those 3 key nutrients. So over half the wheat samples we processed through the lab are deficient in 2 or more out of manganese, copper and zinc. And a similar situation on the rape samples as well. From January to June, over 80% of the tissue samples we saw deficient in a key micronutrient, one of molybdenum, manganese or boron, but again, half deficient in 2 or more. These deficiencies do not occur on their own. The systems, the functions, the reasons why they're occurring mean these deficiencies occur in multiple ways. And the earlier we can identify that, the earlier we can do something about it. And if we don't, these deficiencies persist. Here we've got plotted here our median boron levels in the tissue samples analysed from 2010 to 2015. The red box indicates when the median levels drops into a chronic boron deficiency situation. And we can pick out the orange line there of 2012, following on from a wet winter, has been one of the years when it dipped into that chronic boron deficiency situation. When we plot this year, we can see very early on, wet spring, cold soils, perfect storm for boron deficiency. We saw levels of boron in the tissue samples through the lab drop in at an alarming rate, entering that boron critical deficient window earlier than we've ever seen before and staying there. So in a way, this is a lesson for us. We have to get better at getting this message to you when we see something in the data early on. But it also shows these deficiencies show themselves early season. That is the time to identify them. That is the time to correct them. So what can we learn from our 500,000 soils and 100,000 leaves? Well, we can certainly see some pretty obvious basic stuff. Half eukaryotic soils require a bit of lime. 1 in 4 are phosphorus deficient, 1 in 3 potassium deficient, but over half require P and K management. in terms of either build-up or maintenance. Soil sulfur levels are exhausted. It's not just something the industry's come up with. Let's talk about sulfur for a change. No, it's very real, and the data shows it's very real. We can see when it comes to nutrient management planning that if you've got variable inputs going in there, you might be building inaccuracies into that nutrient management plan, so do a test. And we can see that the tissue testing is revealing persistent and significant levels of nutrient deficiency that can be corrected through the tank, through our spraying operations, and that these deficiencies don't just exist in isolation, they exist in combination. So perhaps, moving forward, if we are driving for higher yields, we're not going to do it with straight nitrogen. It's going to have to be done through use of nitrogen sulfur compounds, combination of NPK management, NPK products. And when it comes to micronutrient management, we should really be thinking in terms of a crop-specific approach, perhaps as opposed to a nutrient-specific approach. That's at least is what the data is telling us. And this is where analysis comes in. It really gives us the opportunity to identify these limiting factors that are going to hold us back on yield and on the worth of this nitrogen we're bringing. So at present, typical farmer working under current nitrogen application recommendation system, we've got the message through about sulfur. That's going on as well, and that drives and builds the yield in terms of the chemical fertility of that soil. If we're going to push nitrogen application rates higher, yes, maybe we'll get a bit of lime on, maybe yes, we'll remember to continue to use nitrogen sulfur products. But unless we do that test, unless we identify those potential limiting factors, remember what we said, the efficiency of your most, the nutrients in the greatest quantity, nitrogen, is going to be limited by the nutrient that is the most scarce. Perhaps it'll be phosphorus, it could be anything. But analysis gives us the opportunity to see these limiting factors before we go ahead, address them, and then potentially get out of this nitrogen and get to these yields what we want. Otherwise, to butcher a phrase by one of my favourite French novelists and pilot, a goal without a plan might actually just end up being a wish. Thank you very much.